She stood on that platform for 20 minutes while men walked past like she was invisible. 14 years old, Navajo, silent as stone. The auctioneer kept dropping the price. 60, 50, 40, 30. Nobody wanted the broken girl who wouldn't speak, wouldn't smile, wouldn't be what they expected a bought worker to be. "Half price," the auctioneer shouted, desperate now. $25 for... That's when Mason Brooks stepped forward. The weathered rancher with calloused hands and a dead daughter buried 7 years deep. He paid 40, the full price, not because he needed labor, but because everyone else had looked at her and seen nothing. He saw a person. That made all the difference. Mason Brooks had come to Flagstaff for cattle feed, not salvation. At 43, he ran a modest ranch 15 miles south of town, 200 acres of hard Arizona ground that fought him every season. His wife Rebecca had died in childbirth 7 years ago, along with the daughter they'd named Hope. Since then, Mason had worked the land alone, speaking mainly to horses and the occasional ranch hand passing through looking for seasonal work. The November morning was cold and clear when he hitched his wagon outside Thornton's general store. Flagstaff's main street bustled with the usual mix: miners heading to the San Francisco peaks, merchants opening shops, Navajo women selling rugs from blankets spread on the boardwalk. "You hear about the auction?" Old Pete, the store owner, asked as Mason loaded 50-pound sacks of feed. "What auction?" "Over at the livestock yard. McGregor's selling off some Navajo laborers. Says they're available for domestic service." Pete spat. Fancy words for what it really is. Mason's jaw tightened. He knew what it really was. Since the long walk ended in '68, unscrupulous men had exploited Navajo families, particularly orphaned children, under the guise of employment contracts that looked suspiciously like ownership papers. "Law allows it?" Mason asked, though he already knew the answer. "Law looks the other way when there's money involved." Pete handed him a receipt. "Whole thing makes me sick, but what can one man do?" Mason secured the feed bags, paid, and started toward his wagon. He told himself he had cattle to feed, a ranch to run, no business getting involved in Flagstaff's moral failures. He made it halfway down the street before the sound of the auctioneer's voice pulled him toward the livestock yard. The scene was worse than Mason had imagined. 20-odd men crowded around a makeshift platform where Cyrus McGregor, a barrel-chested trader who'd grown wealthy exploiting every loophole in territorial law, stood beside 3 Navajo children. 2 boys, maybe 10 and 12, stood with heads down but shoulders squared. Between them stood a girl who couldn't have been more than 14. She was small, painfully thin, with dark hair hanging loose around a face that showed no expression at all. Her eyes fixed on some point in the middle distance, as if she'd learned that looking at people only brought pain. "Strong boys here," McGregor bellowed. "Good workers! Starting bid, $50 each!" Hands shot up. The boys sold quickly, one to a mining foreman, another to a rancher from Sedona. Mason watched the transactions with growing disgust, but said nothing. Then McGregor gestured to the girl. "Now this one's quiet, real quiet. Don't speak much English, barely speaks at all, really. But she can cook, clean, work a loom." He paused, reading the crowd. $60. Silence. The men shifted uncomfortably. A few whispered. One laughed, making a crude comment that turned Mason's stomach. All right, $50. More silence. The girl hadn't moved, hadn't blinked. She stood like a carved statue, present but absent, there but gone. "Come on now, gentlemen, 40. Nothing. Men turned away, headed for the street. Mason saw it in their faces. She was too damaged, too silent, too much trouble. They wanted workers who'd smile and obey. This girl looked like she might shatter if you spoke too loud. "Half price, $30. McGregor's voice had lost its showman's enthusiasm. The crowd had thinned to a handful of men who stayed only out of morbid curiosity. Mason felt something crack open in his chest. the place where Hope had lived for 3 hours before she stopped breathing. He thought of Rebecca, who'd begged him with her last breath to love hard, even when it hurts. $25, McGregor said desperately. That's robbery for... $40, Mason heard himself say. Every head turned. What's that? McGregor squinted against the sun. Mason stepped forward, pulling bills from his coat pocket, money meant for winter supplies, for new fence wire, for things he actually needed. $40, original asking price. McGregor's face split into a greedy grin. Well now, gentleman with principles, sold to Mr. Brooks, Mason Brooks. The girl's eyes flickered to him for the first time, just a brief glance, quick as a bird, before returning to that safe middle distance. Mason counted out the bills, took the papers McGregor shoved at him, ownership transfer, disguised as an employment contract, and walked toward the platform. "Come on down," he said gently to the girl. She didn't move. "It's all right. I'm not going to hurt you." Still nothing. Mason realized she probably didn't understand English or had learned not to trust anything men said in any language. He extended his hand, not grabbing, just offering. Waited. After a long moment, she descended the steps without taking his hand, following at a distance as he led her to his wagon. The ride back to the ranch took 2 hours. Mason didn't try to talk. He could feel the girl's terror radiating from where she sat in the wagon bed, pressed against the sideboard like she might need to jump and run at any moment. When they arrived, he helped her down. She flinched when he touched her arm and gestured toward the house. "You'll stay in the spare room," he said slowly, pointing. "My wife's old room." No response. Those dark eyes watched him with the wariness of an animal that's learned humans mean pain. Mason showed her the room, small, clean, with a real bed and a window facing east. He showed her the kitchen, the washroom, the barn. She followed silently, taking in everything, revealing nothing. That first week was strange and difficult. She moved through the house like a ghost, cooking simple meals without being asked, cleaning compulsively, always staying just out of reach. She never spoke, not once. Mason couldn't even be sure she understood English beyond basic commands. He didn't ask her to work. He'd made that clear the first day, pulling out the contract McGregor had given him and burning it in the fireplace while she watched. "You're not my property," he'd said. "I don't own you. You're free to leave whenever you want. But if you stay, this is your home, you understand? Home." She'd stared at the burning paper, then at him, then disappeared into her room for the rest of the day. By the end of the second week, Mason was worried. She barely ate, maybe one meal a day, always alone, always quick. She startled at sudden movements. Once, when he dropped a pan in the kitchen, she'd bolted outside and hidden in the barn for 3 hours. "What's your name?" he asked gently one evening as she cleared dinner dishes. Silence. "I'd like to call you something. Doesn't have to be your real name if you don't want to share it. But something." She paused, hands frozen on a plate. For a moment he thought she might speak. Then she finished clearing and disappeared into her room. That night, Mason lay in bed staring at the ceiling, wondering what he'd done. He'd thought he was helping, but maybe he'd just brought a traumatized girl to an isolated ranch with a strange man. Maybe she was more afraid now than she'd been at the auction. Maybe good intentions meant nothing when the damage was already done. The change came on a Tuesday morning 3 weeks after the auction. Mason was in the barn repairing a bridle when he heard it, a sound so soft he almost missed it. Singing. In Navajo. Coming from the direction of the chicken coop. He set down his tools and moved quietly to the barn door. The girl knelt by the coop, scattering feed, singing under her breath. It wasn't a happy song. The melody was haunting, almost mournful, but it was human. It was alive. Mason felt his throat tighten. That evening, he did something he'd been planning for days. He set 2 plates on the table instead of leaving hers on the counter. When she came to serve him, he gestured to the second chair. "Sit, please." She hesitated, glancing at the door. "I'd like the company," he said. "Been eating alone for 7 years. Gets old." She looked at the chair, at him, at the door. Then slowly she sat. They ate in silence, but it was different somehow. Less frightened, more there. After dinner, as she washed dishes, Mason pulled out something he'd carved over the past week, a small wooden bird about the size of his palm. Not perfect, but recognizable. "I made this," he said, setting it on the counter beside her. "For you." She stared at the bird, reached out one finger to touch it. Then so quietly, he almost didn't hear. "Nora." Mason froze. "What?" "Nora." Louder this time. She looked at him directly for the first time since the auction. "My name. Nora." "Nora," Mason repeated, testing it. "That's a beautiful name. My mother—" She stopped, struggling with English words. "My mother give me. Before she—" She didn't finish. Didn't need to. Mason understood loss. "My wife's name was Rebecca," he said. "She died 7 years ago, her and our daughter." Nora's eyes softened, the first crack in the wall. "We're both alone," Mason continued. "But maybe we don't have to be." She picked up the wooden bird, held it carefully. "Why?" she asked. "Why you by me? Because nobody else would. Because it was wrong. Because—" He paused, searching for truth. "Because 7 years ago I held my daughter for 3 hours before she died, and I couldn't save her. But I could save you. Maybe that doesn't make sense." "It makes sense," Nora said quietly. She clutched the bird to her chest. "Thank you for see me." That night, for the first time since Rebecca died, Mason didn't feel alone in his own house. Spring arrived slowly in northern Arizona. By April, Nora had transformed from a ghost into a presence. She still didn't talk much. Trauma doesn't heal on a schedule. But when she did speak, it mattered. She taught Mason basic Navajo phrases. He taught her to read English using Rebecca's old books. They cooked together, worked the ranch together, sat by the fire in companionable silence. The town noticed. Mason heard the whispers when he brought Nora to Flagstaff for supplies, speculation about that rancher and the Indian girl. He ignored it all. Let them talk. They didn't understand, and he didn't owe them explanations. One evening in late April, as they watched the sunset from the porch, Nora spoke. "Mason?" "Yeah. You know I can leave. You tell me this many times." "I know. I don't want leave." Mason looked at her, this girl who'd stood unsold at an auction, who'd been invisible to everyone but him, who'd somehow become the family he thought he'd lost forever. "I don't want you to leave either," he said. "Good." She smiled, rare but genuine. "Because this is my home now, and you—" She paused, searching for the word. "You are my father now, if you want." Mason felt his eyes burn. He'd buried one daughter 7 years ago. He'd never imagined he'd gain another. "I'd be honored," he said, voice rough with emotion. Nora leaned against his shoulder, a gesture of trust that would have been impossible 4 months ago. "Thank you," she whispered, "for stepping forward when nobody else would." "Thank you for staying," Mason replied, "for letting me be your family." They sat together as the Arizona sky turned from gold to purple to black. Two people who'd been broken by loss, discovering that family isn't something you're born into. It's something you choose, something you build, something you protect. That night, Mason pulled out the legal papers he'd been working on with a lawyer in Flagstaff. Formal adoption documents, replacing the burned contract with something real and right. In the morning, he'd explain them to Nora. Tell her she'd have his name if she wanted it. Legal protection, inheritance rights, everything a daughter should have. But tonight, they just existed together in the quiet peace of knowing they weren't alone anymore. The rancher who'd stepped forward when no one else would. the silent girl who'd finally found her voice. Two broken pieces discovering they fit together better than either had been whole. Family, not by blood or law or obligation, but by choice. And that made it real.